is regular heavenly language. This is not weird. This is normal. We ask God. We ask God. We acknowledge that it's a gift from Him. And then we said we're available.
What you just heard is what millions of Pentecostals and Charismatics identify as the biblical gift of tongues. It is a gift that is usually believed to be an unintelligible spiritual language individually crafted by the Holy Spirit. But what many don't know is that this is not what the earliest Pentecostals believed. In fact, today's understanding of tongues was mainly shaped by a tremendous public embarrassment in the forming years of Pentecostalism. If you want to know more about that, please stay tuned for this episode of Digging Deeper. Both Charles Fox Parham, who is the founder of Pentecostalism, and William J. Seymour, who led the Azusa Street Revival, believed that speaking in tongues was the supernatural ability to speak in previously unlearned, intelligible human languages, which is sometimes referred to as Xenolalia. None of the earliest Pentecostals believed that tongues consisted of unintelligible utterances. So how did the understanding of this gift change? Let's get a historical overview of early Pentecostalism. Parham and his students at Bethel Bible College in Topeka, Kansas, gained increasing interest in the baptism of the Holy Spirit. After Parham's students concluded that this baptism is evidenced by tongue speaking, the whole school began to seek this experience. And so it came about that Agnes Osman, one of Parham's students, asked Parham to lay his hands on her during the New Year's service of 1900. And as he did that, Agnes allegedly began to speak in Chinese and could not speak in English anymore for 3 days. This was the event that not only sparked the Topeka Outpouring, but Pentecostalism as a whole. After that, numerous other students were reported to have supernaturally spoken in other languages such as Russian, Bulgarian, Japanese, Norwegian, French, Hungarian, Italian, and Spanish. And even Parham himself claimed to have suddenly spoken in Swedish. After the Topeka Outpouring, the Pentecostal message began to spread globally. The next big stop was Los Angeles, California. Here the Pentecostal revival flourished under the ministry of William J. Seymour, who was one of Parham's students. In the beginning, the meetings were held at a house on the Bonnie Bray Street. Here it was claimed that Seymour and 7 others fell to the floor and began to speak in tongues. But the house on Bonnie Bray was too small to host the large crowds that would gather on the streets. So they moved to another building on the Azusa Street. This is where the revival turned into sheer madness. In addition to tongue speaking, practices such as holy jumper, holy roller, holy kicker, violent shaking, screaming, and various ecstatic experiences became the norm. Parham himself was shocked when he visited Azusa in October of 1906. But how can we know if these early Pentecostals really spoke in previously unlearned foreign languages? The supporters and critics of the revival offered contradictory eyewitness testimonies. For example, the following is from a critical news article published in 1906. A little Hindu boy told me that a colored man who belongs to Seymour's church came to him and told him that he could speak 16 different languages and said one of them was Hindu. So the young Hindu said, "Well, I can understand that. Let's hear you." He went at it, and the Hindu boy laughed in his face and said, "That is no language." At this, the colored man got mad and struck the boy in the mouth with his fist. All the critical voices of that time identified the Pentecostal Xenolalia as mere gibberish. But how can we be sure? Anecdotal eyewitness accounts often include the issue of confirmation bias. I would argue the test of truth occurred when these early Pentecostals went on mission, believing they could preach to the natives without any need to learn their languages. This event is significant in our evaluation, because the gift of tongues would now be tested in an environment that is not controlled by the Pentecostals themselves. Alfred Goodrich Garr was one of these overconfident missionaries. This is what we know about him. Reverend A.G. Garr and wife, late of the burning bush, and now connected with the tongues wildfire, have arrived in India with their languages with which they were expecting to preach to the natives. And as predicted, nobody can understand their tongues, neither do they themselves know what they are saying. So they are now praying for the gift of interpretation. In other words, their boasted gift with which they were going to outshine our real missionaries by talking directly to the natives without having learned the language is no good whatever. In the meantime, they can only preach to the English-speaking people, awaiting the arrival of the interpretation gift. In another article, a good friend of Mr. Garr adds some more details, and this is what he writes. Mr. Garr, who ridiculed the idea of missionaries having to study the language of the heathen 2 years before preaching to them, has found out that his Hindu is not Hindu, and they are longing for the missionaries who have studied the language to get the power and preach to the Indians. But Mr. Garr is not the only one who is known for this type of failure on the mission field. S.C. Todd, who was a missionary from the Holiness Movement, personally investigated the claims of Pentecostal missionaries. The historian Robert Mapes Anderson summarizes Todd's findings well. S.C. Todd of the Bible Missionary Society investigated 18 Pentecostals who went to Japan, China, and India, expecting to preach to the natives in those countries in their own tongue, and found that by their own admission, in no single instance have they been able to do so. As these and other missionaries returned in disappointment and failure, Pentecostals were compelled to rethink their original view of speaking in tongues. After the missionary tongues failed, Pentecostals were confronted with a serious theological dilemma. And I call this dilemma the Great Pentecostal Disappointment. And yes, this designation is meant to remind us of the Millerites and early Adventists. As many of you know, the Millerites were confronted with the public embarrassment of failed prophecy. They claimed that Christ would return in 1844, which did not happen, of course. But instead of honestly admitting their mistake, they simply redefined the meaning of the prophecy. This is a typical response of fanatics who are dealing with public embarrassment and cognitive dissonance. In like manner, when the missionary tongues failed, these early Pentecostals did not admit their mistake. Instead, they reinterpreted their experience and created a second category of tongues. And early on, they used the exact same arguments from 1 Corinthians 12 to 14 that are used by today's Pentecostals and Charismatics. Blosser and Sullivan, who are both experts on the history of tongue speaking, explain the timing of the redefinition. The Pentecostal understanding of tongues began changing between 1906 and 1907, when their concept of missionary tongues failed. Not long afterward, probably by around 1910, Pentecostals had concluded that Xenolalia, or the speaking of foreign languages, was no longer viable as a standalone definition for tongues. All of that leads us to the following shocking conclusion. The early Pentecostals' need to avoid public embarrassment led millions of other Pentecostals and Charismatics embrace a counterfeit gift. What modern tongue speakers practice is not the biblical gift of tongues. Now, some of you might still remain skeptical, because for you it is very difficult to read 1 Corinthians and not come to the conclusion that the gift of tongues includes unintelligible utterances, especially when you read something like 1 Corinthians 14:2. This is what Marcus Rogers thinks about this verse.
And so in 1 Corinthians 14:2, this is a verse that many people overlook when they talk about tongues. All right. It's like, I don't know how they miss it. They don't see it, but it's just a big, life-changing verse. It'll change your perspective. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit. I was trying to get, Alan Parr to, consider this verse and think about what it means in context, because the Bible cannot contradict itself.
What Marcus does not know is that his understanding of 1 Corinthians 14:2 ultimately comes as the result of the failed missionary tongues. A decade after this embarrassment, the Pentecostal magazine Weekly Evangel commented on 1 Corinthians 14 with a changed mind. And this is what they wrote. This is not a gift of different languages as some have believed, but is an emotional or heavenly language in which the speaker speaks only to God. But it gets even worse, as Blosser and Sullivan point out. Pentecostals actually relied on the writings of higher criticism in their efforts to redefine the gift of tongues. The liberal higher critics are the ones who came up with the term glossolalia and gave this term a certain definition. This is how Blosser and Sullivan conclude in their long-term research on the redefinition of tongues. Tongues as something other than ordinary human languages is utterly unprecedented in church history, completely unknown in ecclesiastical writings before the 19th century, when a few German theologians of the Protestant school of higher criticism first introduced the theory of glossolalia. And what these higher critics meant by glossolalia was an ecstatic speech. That was their way of rationalizing the actual gift of tongues. This means that the modern charismatic and Pentecostal understanding of tongues is not supported by 18 centuries of Christian writings. So how should you read 1 Corinthians then? If you're desperate to know that, I would like to refer you to another video in which I go through all the Bible verses on tongues. You can find the link to this video in the description below. Alright everyone, I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel. But as for now, I wish you a very blessed time and hopefully see you soon.